and welcome to the Pragmatic Product Chat series, where we tackle the biggest challenges facing today's product management, product marketing, and other market and data-driven professionals with some of the best minds in the industry. I'm Rebecca Calageris for Pragmatic Institute and your host for this episode. Today, I am extremely excited about our guest. Our guest, Anuj Jhunjhunwala, he's the director of product management for Merge now, but he's also been at Lyft and Stashable and Vesper, a full career and lots of different perspectives. And he's brought some hot takes on a variety of different topics that I think are going to be really fun to explore. So welcome, Anuj.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right. I always like to start with the origin story, right? Like, how did you get where you are today, and why are you so passionate about what it is that you do?
Yeah, totally. So I'm one of those career switchers.
Yes.
I actually started my career in finance way back when here in New York. I was in banking, and then I went to a hedge fund for a little bit. And what was really fascinating to me about that initial part of my career in finance is that it taught me how to work, right? It taught me how to work hard. In finance and banking, you're working 80-hour weeks. At the hedge fund, I was getting to the office at like 7 a.m. and reading the news and trying to figure out what we could be doing that day based on the news. And one common theme, though, was that I was spending a lot of time researching other companies, right? So I was thinking about different companies that we could invest in, or in the banking side, different companies that we could help with some sort of debt raising and things like that. And so in talking to these companies, in reading their 10Ks and 10Qs and all this, it occurred to me that what they were doing was really fascinating. And it's a lot of stuff that I wouldn't have thought about, frankly. There was one company I remember talking to that made the software that mapped the undersea floor for companies to go, do stuff with, to drill. And I was like, I would never have thought that this was a company. This is a $500 million company. It's a very big company. And the people who were running it were very passionate about what they did, and they enjoyed it. And I'm thinking to myself, I would love to build something like this. Maybe not exactly this product, but it's a very fascinating thing to own something like this and just come in every morning and work on it. And so after a little bit, I ended up learning how to code. I made the switch over to tech, worked at a small B2B startup, and then actually over time co-founded my own thing, raised some money, went through an accelerator, and it was one of the most formative experiences of my career. We ended up shutting it down actually a few years later, but I love that feeling of trying to rapidly grow this thing and kind of really trying to do whatever you can to scale it. There was a point at which we were going door to door near Union Square in New York, talking to food vendors to see if they would use this product. That was kind of in the food waste space. And it was a very just fascinating thing to work on that. And I felt kind of I was scratching that itch of what I was learning about in finance. Ultimately, over time, made my way over to Lyft, where I focused on what we call the waiting experience. So you book a Lyft ride and you're waiting for a driver.
Oh, we all know that experience.
Yeah, everyone knows it. You're just staring at the screen.
Will they come? Yes.
Why is this guy going the wrong way? There's a whole series of emotions you're feeling during this whole thing. And it got even more interesting during COVID because there was fewer drivers, people were not going anywhere. And so it's a very fascinating mix of machine learning and user psychology and lots of experimentation. But after a little bit of time there, 4.5 years, I realized that kind of inadvertently, all the different PM jobs I'd had over the last few years were very ops heavy, right? So there were, there's Lyft, which is obviously the two people have to meet and go somewhere, and that's how Lyft makes money. Before that, it was actually a consumer storage startup. So we'd come to your apartment, take stuff, and go put it in a warehouse and bring it back to you when you needed it. Again, we have to go pick up something from your apartment. And so I wanted to do something that was the opposite of that. What are the different aspects of Lyft? It's B2C, it's ops heavy, it's a larger company, it's public. And so I'm looking out there, and the day that I started looking, I got an outreach from a company called Merge, which is B2B. It exists at a very different layer of the stack than a company like Lyft. It's a startup. And so I thought to myself, this is how I can push myself. I really want to go into this very different area and see how I can flex my skills as a product manager. And that's kind of where I am now. I'm at a company called Merge, which is a B2B Series B startup. We're all about integrations, so we make it easy for companies to integrate with third-party vendors. You're trying to build a expense management platform or an AI chatbot or a security compliance tool. You need to pull your customers' data from NetSuite, SharePoint, Jira, a bunch of others. And so we have 220 plus integrations. We make it very easy to integrate with those companies. And to me, that's it was a very fun challenge. And it still continues to be a fun challenge to come here and scale this team and like think about what product management means for this kind of company. And it all started from way back in the day, looking at different companies and seeing what's out there and thinking, I really want to do this.
It's interesting because you demonstrated throughout all of those stories, like one of the traits that I think make the best product managers and maybe one of the most important. And it's that curiosity, right? Like we find it fascinating to look at the market and figure out how the business works, right? Because when you're really curious, you're curious externally, you're curious internally, you're curious about what's happening with your peers. And like, it feeds us, right? It's one of the reasons that I also think that product managers can be good product managers like yours across domains, right? I understand that it can be great if you have domain expertise, but I actually think that curiosity, those fresh eyes, means that you can drop us in all kinds of places. And actually, that's where we thrive, right? It's like, it's like the best part is learning it for the first time.
Yeah, totally. I think at the end of the day, we're all solving problems, right? No matter what your job is, PMs especially, but engineers and designers and like everyone you come across at a tech company is ultimately trying to solve a problem of sorts. And relentless curiosity is like the one thing that you have to have as table stakes here. We kind of think of like there's three things that make someone successful at a place like Merge, right? It's, can you handle the ambiguity? Do you have agency, right? Do you go out and look for things that are broken and think to yourself, I need to fix this somehow? Are you good at communication, right? And like all three of those things kind of wrap up together into this thing of like, am I relentlessly curious about what's happening around me? And do I have some sort of innate desire to fix it or to push things forward and move the ball forward? So it's definitely a leading indicator. And it's kind of what pushed me to come here.
Nice. Okay. So as we were talking and getting ready for this, we were like, there's lots of different ways we can go. And it was really fun because you had some like really good hot take point of views. And the first one is around data. Right?
Yeah.
You've been on the B2C side and you've been on the B2C side. There's like overloads of data and there's data like envy. So tell me your hot take on data.
Totally. So I think the hot take here is that most companies fall into two buckets. They're either way too reliant on data to make decisions, or they're trying to get to that point where they are overly reliant on data. And I think that the issue here isn't using data. Like obviously looking at data is very helpful. It's the degree to which you use it. And I've seen companies where every single thing was A/B tested. It implies that the numbers matter more than intuition. It puts a lot of trust into like what you're measuring, how you're measuring it, how clean is the data. And I think it also kind of over the long term, as you grow out a team, a product management team, it creates incentives to generate short-term wins, right? So your metric moves 5% the right way. And suddenly there's a bias to ship whatever you did that led to that 5% increase without fully understanding why. And there's ways to get around that. You can have holdout groups. You can like keep 10% of the population within that experimentation variant and just see what happens over the next year or so. But it's still, that requires investment. That requires upfront thought. And the truth is that you're going to have gaps in what you can measure. You're going to have gaps in how you can measure it. And so data is a compass. It helps you make decisions, but it should never be the single reason you do something. And so I kind of see that on 2 points, right? There's like the companies who are already there. And then there's companies who are like, well, we need to start tracking everything. We need to install all these different bits of data, software that can help us track all these things. And that's helpful to a degree. If you overdo it, I think you end up in a space where we call it p-hacking, right? You're basically trying to throw spaghetti at the wall, see what happens, see what numbers move the right way, and then ship those things. And ultimately, I think that just takes you away from your customer and what the customer actually needs long term.
I think of it too sometimes like if you have like if you're flying in an airplane, which I don't do, so this is gonna be a terrible analogy. Let's just admit that right away. But you're only looking at the dash and you see all the dials and I'm fixing the dials but I'm never looking up and making sure that we're heading where we want to go. And I think sometimes that's what happens with companies that like over rely on data and don't spend some time thinking long term, don't think about the bigger pieces, is that you're almost fine tuning yourself into almost paralysis. Like you may be making incremental improvements, but you're never really advancing on the long-term strategy or vision.
Totally. And I think it's kind of a spectrum of customer obsession, right? So there's like the extreme with customer obsession is that you almost like overfit your roadmap based on what customers are telling you, as opposed to like your own product intuition, your own product taste of what customers want. The opposite extreme is that you're staring at a dashboard of data and everything you do has to be reflected in that dashboard. And you're not actually like thinking about what the customer needs. So there's kind of two extremes here where you over listen or you under listen. And I think data is itself just a lens by which you can understand what a customer is doing. You need to have multiple lenses. You need to be thinking about all the different ways you can access what your customer's trying to do with your product.
And I mentioned it's interesting because you came from obviously Lyft, which has an enormous amount of data. It is B2C, and you've been in the investment space, which is data extraordinaire. And so many B2B companies are constantly thinking we need to be more like B2C in this space. And we need to, and there is 100% lessons to learn that we should be using, but it's also, I think it can be, as you said, easy to over dial in on that spot and miss the other pieces.
Totally. And to your point, I think it is something that's a little bit more prevalent in B2C just because there's so much, your population size is so much bigger that A/B tests actually have meaningful results. I think at a smaller company or at a B2B company, you're just talking about smaller numbers, larger customers, smaller numbers. So the A/B testing, stuff is a little bit less relevant, but you still, I think you're kind of, the narrative is still shaped by, I'm data driven. Like everything I do relies on this, but that can ultimately be harmful in a lot of ways, I think.
Yes. So we talked a lot about your sort of like your path, your history, with your very interesting different experiences you've been from the business side. But we didn't talk about is some of the personal changes that have also happened, right?
Yeah.
Anuj, let's start. What's your next hot take?
Yeah, totally. So number 2 here is I think this is product management is inherently an uncertain job. And your job at the end of the day is to manage that uncertainty. Any tool, any framework, any process you use is ultimately in service of managing that uncertainty. And so spend your time appropriately. It probably does not make a ton of sense to spend a ton of time designing the perfect roadmap, for example. It's going to change. And so if you think about the time that you spend prioritizing and deprioritizing things, that might be a better, more fruitful way to spend your time. It's almost like what is changing and how do I kind of isolate what is changing and try to figure out the best way to manage that. So think about how you communicate decisions. How do you storytell? How do you get people on board with what's happening? How do you build an org that's resilient to things changing? Good PMs manage products. Great PMs, I think, manage the uncertainty that comes around managing products.
That's super interesting too, because you touched on it briefly, like how you communicate, knowing that when we talk about uncertainty, we know that the market changes, the technology changes. These days, everything changes constantly, right? So that's what we're talking about is there's constant change and you need to be watching these things so that you can react appropriately with your plans and your paces. But that also means like gone are the days, I don't know that there were ever these days, right? But that you would like go into a meeting and you'd be like, here is the answer. And that's like the edict from the hill. You would have to change how you talked about it so that people have confidence in what you're doing now, but understand that what we're doing now is going to be continually evolved, right? So like, you don't want them to think you don't know. Like, my best guess, this is what we should try. Like, that's not what you want to do. But tell me a little bit about how you balance that, knowing things are going to be fluid, but still needing to give people confidence to follow.
Yeah, totally. I think it's about balancing the message a little bit. So it's like within this hot take, you can still say things like, here are our big themes, our big pillars for the year. Here are the goals we have as a company. And I think that should be more durable, right? That should be something that you don't change every 2 weeks because that's not a good idea. It should just be like, this is kind of where we're headed. This is the North Star. This is where we want to go. But the tactics that you do to get there can change. And there are opportunities for sure where you can go back and say that goal that we have for the year wasn't the right one. So we're going to go ahead and change that as well. And the important thing is to kind of set that initial story of what the year looks like. Why are we setting this goal? Why is this important for us? And then there's the framework or the publicizing the decision making, like changing the story as it happens, or this is what new information has come in, and this is why we're going this different direction, or this is like, these are the 3 things we're going to test out this quarter that are different from what we tested out last quarter, and that's why we're doing this. And so I think it's about having that kind of like longer term vision, that longer term idea of where you want to go as a business, the goals that you want to set to do that, but then also making it very clear that this is not, a gigantic company in like the 70s, right? Like I remember I worked with someone on the team a few years ago, And we were just doing some planning, and he was like, it'd be great if we just had this like one thing we were working on for years at a time. And like I could like focus on it and I could build it.
Like, oh no.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm like, I get you, like I hear you, but that also probably tells you that the your product is like almost like in the stasis, right? You're not evolving because inherently part of what we're doing here is we're in hyper growth industries. We're building products that are rapidly evolving. They're changing. The market's changing. And so if you're staying in one spot, you're not moving with the market.
Yeah.
And so it's about kind of like balancing these two things. What is the longer term vision? Where we're kind of going? What are our goals? And what are the tactics that get us there? And just managing the uncertainty that comes with that, because there's going to be uncertainty, and the best way to do that is just embrace the uncertainty as it happens.
Yeah. It sounds like embrace the uncertainty, and then communication and transparency with the team is going to be really critical so that everyone is following along. Yeah. And again, so don't build anything with the expectation it's going to be the same in 3 years. Nothing is the same now that it was 3 years ago.
Totally.
Yeah.
Product market fit is not a binary state.
No.
It's more of like a constant evolution that you can have it, you can lose it, right? The market's going to move out from underneath you. Your competitors do something different. And so it's about realizing that this is all kind of you're trying to reach the limit, and the limit is slightly moving itself. It's constant evolution that gets you there, which actually kind of segues into another hot take that's sort of related to this, which is if your roadmap is looking the same as it did 3 months ago, you're probably not paying attention.
Yeah.
There's, three things that kind of go into a good roadmap. There's the market. What does the market need? There's your products. How are you building it? There's what do consumers need, your customers. And right off the bat, if you look at that, the market's constantly changing. It's changing every single day. What your customers need is also changing, right? There's competitors that come in, do their own thing. And so if your product is the third bit of that triangle that's not changing, what's happening? So to assume that your roadmap is going to stay the same throughout all this is, again, signaling that you're just not thinking far enough in advance, or you're not thinking in a mentality that's adaptive to change. So just embrace the uncertainty. Treat your roadmap as a series of hypotheses, big bets that you're testing. Make sure that you're constantly pushing yourself and getting the team to think about that. And I think that'll help reduce the thrash when it does happen.
Yeah. I mean, it's clear then too that that is 100% true. If all these other pieces are moving and you're staying still, you're the one that's going to be out of alignment very soon. It is, I think, for some of the listeners who work at like larger enterprise organizations, they agree, and then they struggle because there's just big mechanisms around it. Or some of your earlier organizations where there was there was like a hard piece of it that feels more difficult to pivot than like, hey, yep, I got a SaaS software where this is our life, this is our rhythm. I imagine when we're talking some of those things that are more hardware or larger organizations, that feeling of how do I give enough visibility for my leadership, my partners, my board, and also not just, put a stake in the ground that shouldn't be there is a tough balance act.
Totally. And I think it's, it definitely depends on the product you're building, right? There are certain products, especially like hardware or things that kind of maybe in a very regulated space, for example, where you do need to set up these longer roadmaps. And the possibility, the chance that things are going to change dramatically within one quarter is much lower just because you have longer term goals. And so I think I'm coming from a B2B Series B company where we're constantly evolving and thinking about what the next big thing is. For us, that wavelength, that phase is much shorter. I think it's all about kind of reading the room of like, what is that wavelength for you? Is it like, we think that there are massive shifts every few months? Is it every few weeks? Is it, we're a very hyperscale B2C thing where it's like every few days matters and you're trying to like attain some sort of virality in this thing. Identify what that is and then work backwards from that. So if you think that a good cadence for the team to be revisiting its assumptions is every 6 weeks, then build that in, right? Be like, here's our year-long goal. For the next 6 weeks though, this is what we're going to focus on. If it's a shorter thing than that, make it a week, make it 2 weeks, make it a sprint almost. If it's a longer term thing, if it's every 6 months you're going to change something, then just set that cadence up front. Obviously things can still change, but you want to make it feel less out of the blue when it does happen, because the reality is that there's no product on the market that, you can say with certainty, this is how it's going to work a year from now or 2 years from now.
No,
So
not at all.
that's definitely way too long. Yeah.
And I think you made a good point earlier when you talked a little bit about like the level, it's also the level of zoom of what we're talking about with different people, right? Like if our goal is international expansion, that's a goal, right?
Yep.
And that can stay pretty consistent, but the pieces that we're going to work on, the regions that are going to be what's needed, all of those are hypotheses under a bigger theme. And so I think also important that you're being very iterative at all levels, but also that for some of your constituents, for some of your stakeholders, it's important to communicate at the higher level where it's still meaningful to them, but that they don't need to feel the churn, because the churn is positive in reality, but may feel like they don't know what they're doing if you don't see it, right? So I think it's communication and transparency, but at the appropriate level for that stakeholder, I think is really important as well.
Absolutely. It always comes down to storytelling at the end of the day.
Yep.
Sorry, light went off. It comes down to storytelling at the end of the day. So if you, I remember at Lyft, I had a director of product who had just joined the company, really friendly guy. And when, I think it was my second quarter at Lyft, we were going to miss our OKRs as a team. There were a few experiments that didn't go well. And I remember being like, how do I approach this? Like, what is your recommendation for how to handle something like this, where we had all these big bets, one or two of them didn't work out, and that kind of tanked our overall number, and what happens next? And he was like, do you have a story? Do you have a takeaway? Is there something you learned from this? Because that's all that's important, right? Like there's almost like a 2x2 quadrant. Did the experiment work or not? Did you hit your OKRs? And the other one is, did you learn something from it? And so if you're in this bucket of it failed and you didn't learn anything, I'm questioning what you did for the last 3 months.
Yep.
But if it failed and you learned something, great.
Yeah.
Tell the rest of the team. Like, make sure other people understand what didn't go well so they can avoid the same thing in the future. Or maybe it's just something that no one could have seen coming, and that's also fine. But you need to be able to tell that story. And that's ultimately what someone at his level and the people above them cared about the most, was like, what are we doing as a team to grow this product? What are we trying out? Why did something not work? What can we do better next time? And so it's all storytelling at a different level. For them, it's that story. For the team, it's, why are we taking these big bets? Why is this important? Why is this exciting to work on as a product? So it's storytelling at different levels, but at the end of the day, it's all, can you take what you did here and wrap it up nicely so that people understand what you did?
Nice. All right. That's a good hot takes there. PM, product management is inherently a uncertain job. And if your roadmap is the same and after 3 months, you're probably not paying attention, right? What else you got for me?
A couple more. So I think people are much more open to you saying no than you probably think they are. And I think this is something I had to learn over time as well. I always felt that a good PM had to find ways to say yes, right? Like no could damage relationships, make me seem unhelpful. I think unless you're a psychopath, you're at least partly a people pleaser. You want to build relationships, both internal and external. But I think this ultimately, everyone's resource constrained. There's only so much you can do. This leads to overextension. You can't do everything. And so the alternative is you present ambiguity. You say maybe. You take too long to ultimately say no anyway, which means that you lose trust with whoever you're talking to. And people at the end of the day just want clarity, right? They're like, a clear, thoughtful no is way better than a maybe, and it's way better than an overstretched yes, which is just lying to them at some point. Ambiguity is the real enemy. So people want to kind of know where you stand on something. They can always react, right? They can disagree with the no, they can push back on it, but at least you have been clear in what you're saying. And I think that's something that personally for me took a long time to understand and realize fully. But I think it's something that is hard to kind of grasp.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of our job is saying no.
Yeah.
But there is a whole art form to saying no the right way, right?
Exactly.
And it is hard, right? Because I don't like being the department of no. I don't like it when everyone's like, she's going to say no again, right? Like,
yep.
I dislike it immensely, but sometimes it is the best thing I can do. But it's, understanding, it's explaining the no as it relates to the strategy and as it relates to what got the yeses. Right?
Exactly.
Like this is a no, but that's because this is the yes and this is why I think is really important. But again, I do think sometimes they think we enjoy it and I hate it. I hate saying the no, but it is the job I signed up for.
Yeah,
right?
Totally.
Yeah.
It's the job, and it's, to your point, all about balance, right? You obviously can't say no to everything, but finding that right balance, having something else to point to say this is what we're doing instead is the tactic that works almost all the time, right? Because it's like, this is what we find is a better, higher priority. This is why we're working on that. Goes back to the storytelling component. Then people can be like, oh, okay, well, I may disagree with it, but I understand why.
Yeah.
If you just say no, and I remember reading somewhere like no is a complete sentence. I don't agree with that. Like, sure it is. It's a complete sentence. But if you are just saying no and not explaining why, then I think people do start to see you as a department of no, and they need to understand why you're making decisions so that they can also at least, understand your framework, understand where you're coming from on a decision like this.
Absolutely. And the other thing I would say on the other side of this, I also think it's really important for us to understand why they requested it, why they asked, right?
Exactly.
And even sometimes just asking that and listening to it, there can sometimes be like, oh, if that's what you're trying to solve, we are solving that with this. But also it makes them feel very hurt. And sometimes we're just like, no, I don't have time. And that also is not the right thing, right? So knowing why they asked and asking those pieces is also important.
Totally. It's always ultimately a negotiation, right? It's negotiating with the customer, with internal stakeholders. What are we trying to do here? And really understanding and figuring that out with them.
All right. Another great hot take.
Yeah. This is the final one. I think the way you write is extremely important, but also no one reads anything. So it's kind of like finding that right balance there. I'm one of those people who obsesses over
This breaks my heart
word.
as a person who started as a writer, just so we're clear. It breaks my heart. I don't disagree with you, but it breaks my heart.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where I'm one of those people who obsesses over every word. I spend more time editing than writing the initial draft. And to go back to the previous point about storytelling, good writing absolutely does make a difference, right? If you're talking about why are we building this? What did we learn from this experiment? What's our vision? The best medium to kind of spread that is going to be something written because it's a durable artifact. You can post it in Slack and then a bunch of people can read it as opposed to like an all hands or something, which is a one-time event. I also think writing is a great exercise to structure your arguments, to sit down and just like put it on paper. It can force you to form your thoughts in a more coherent way than if you're just like speaking extemporaneously. But the reality is that people don't read anything, right? Like I remember at Lyft, we used to, especially during COVID when there was fewer drivers available, it wasn't uncommon in certain markets to request a ride. And then 4 or 5 minutes later, we would say, sorry, there's no drivers available. And it would be like this big pop-up. You couldn't miss it. No drivers available. Very sorry. And you had to click OK. And the rate at which people would re-request, they would go back to the starting page and then try it again, was way higher than I would have expected. And yes, there's some people who are just like, I got to get to the airport. I got to go somewhere. So like, this is my only option. But it was higher. It was like high enough to the point where I was like, are people actually just reading this note that pops up and says no drivers available? Because there's no drivers. Re-requesting is not going to get you anywhere.
There's still no drivers.
There's still no drivers. And so I think there's, even in a moment like that, where reading 3 words would have been very impactful to the experience here, people still just kind of gloss over it. And that's not an indictment of people's ability to read. It's
the truth.
It's the truth. There's a lot of things going on. There's a distraction. Like people ultimately don't have time to read what you put in front of them. There's a million Slack messages. There's a million emails. Everyone's just trying to do their own thing. And I think the most cogent example of this is Amazon, right? They're famous for the 6-page memos. They put a lot of emphasis on the written word. And yet in the meetings where they discuss these 6-page memos, they have time allotted to sit down and spend the first 15, 20 minutes reading the doc because they know that otherwise there's not any time to read these things. People have little time to read. And so I think the major takeaway here is to just write so that others can skim, right? Like be impossible to ignore, bullets, bolding, TLDRs, repeat the key things across multiple channels here. So you have a doc, repeat the same bullet points in Slack, in meetings, in all hands, and the meeting where you discuss whatever doc it is, like summarize things up front. Understanding that there is this artifact that people can go look at, but at the end of the day, they're not going to look at it. There's a broader point here as well, which kind of stems from Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things, right? Like everything was designed with intent. Every product you use. And the things that you build as a PM, the artifacts you build, whether it's running a meeting or the docs or, a deck or whatever it is. They need to be designed with the same level of care because ultimately you have users of this product, which in this case, a deck is a product. A deck is a product. A meeting is a product. Who are the users? Maybe they're people from your company who are joining the meeting. What are they trying to get out of it? What are you trying to get out of it? And how can you structure this thing to be a well-designed product? So it's kind of all this, broader point of accessibility, storytelling, and just making sure you're meeting the person you're trying to meet where they are in a way that works for both of you.
Yeah. It's funny though, too, because I am a reader. Like I started as a writer and I love to read. So I am the person, like if you say read this before the meeting, I read it. And then I'm very frustrated in the meeting where we spend the first half of the meeting reviewing what it says. Going like, but I did read it so that we could skip this part.
Exactly.
But then on the reverse side of that, it took me a long time to realize that I was the exception to the rule. And again, this is not an indictment to other people. And that going in assuming they had read everything was a bad idea. That, finding the balance was key. Yeah.
It's kind of astonishing when you think about it and zoom out, like the number of distractions we have, the competition for anyone's time or anyone's eyeballs is just out of this world. Right. And so you have to proceed accordingly. You have to assume that people just don't have the time to spend focused on whatever it is that is taking up a lot of your time. And what's like the snippet, what's the tip that they care about the most that you can kind of point and say, this is what we need to talk about. Is going to be super important because no one's going to sit down and read a 10-page memo for fun.
Excellent. All right. There's some seriously good hot takes today. If you were going to have listeners do 2 things differently tomorrow, based on what we talked about today, what would it be?
Yeah. So I think it's about almost doing a uncertainty audit, right? That's the number one thing. It's thinking about what are the things that have changed my roadmap or the things that make me question assumptions or whatever it is. Write those things down and then think about ways you can quickly validate or invalidate the riskiest one. Really think about, and this ties to another concept that I've listened to or heard about in other podcasts and other like newsletters is an energy audit, right? When you look at your calendar, what are the meetings that made you feel good? The meetings that sapped your energy, and try to reduce the ones that sap your energy. This is a very similar concept. I think it's like, what are the decisions that take the most time for me to do? And what are the decisions that are easier? Maybe find ways to delegate the second one. The first one, find ways to kind of de-risk them and make them less risky to your roadmap, if that makes sense. The second one thing is, I think, to the more recent point around designing things intentionally. So really think about all the artifacts that you manage, that you run into on a daily basis, meetings, docs, all hands, whatever it is. In what ways could you be more intentional about designing each one of them? What is one thing that you could approach as a product itself and change the way you're interfacing with it, change the way you're building it, designing it, knowing that there's someone in your company or a customer who is going to use this thing and they need to use this for a certain way. So I think it's just kind of, both these things are just the intentionality of like how you spend your time, how does a week look to you? But it's a mindset shift that's very subtle. And once you start to think about that, I think you start to put yourselves in another person's shoes and change how you design these things ultimately. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Anuj. It was great having you on. Thank you for your perspective on some great topics. And we really enjoyed having you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a blast. I really enjoyed the conversation and I look forward to it.
Excellent. All right. That does it for today's episode. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And don't forget to join us next week when we tackle another great topic designed to help you elevate your product, your company, and your career.